Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the mental traps that our brains fall into when we deal with new ideas and what we can do about it. The bank where I used to work ran an annual innovators competition where employees from all over the organization were encouraged to provide ideas on how to make improvements. The ideas were collected centrally and then sent out to the various departments that were responsible for assessing that particular area. So once a month we'd have a management meeting where we'd have a whole bunch of ideas that we were required to assess to see whether it was worth taking forward. The problem is the default attitude seemed to be, we're going to get a whole bunch of really bad ideas to look at and we have to find a reason to reject all of them. It used to drive me nuts. The reality though is that it's quite a common attitude. In fact, it seems to be the default in almost every corporate ideas assessment forum that I've been involved in. People naturally resist ideas, and the more important and the more creative the idea, the more likely it is to be strongly resisted. So why does it happen? Take a look at this map of the world. Now, as a kid, I used to marvel at how the continents of the world just seemed to fit together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Take Africa and South America, for example. They just seem to fit. Now, cast your mind back to primary school geography, where you learnt about a concept called continental drift. If you're like me, you've probably forgotten everything that you learnt at school, so I'm going to quickly refresh your memory. Basically, billions of years ago, all the continents were one big landmass called Gondwana land, and slowly they started drifting apart. And even today they're moving apart, but very, very, very slowly. Now this seems obvious if you look at a map of the world. And as early as 1620, Francis Bacon noticed it and said, this cannot be by chance. Yet the idea of continental drift was only accepted 350 years later. You see, the common beliefs at the time were the earth has not changed since creation. This in fact was the view of the Catholic Church, and at the time it was very dangerous to challenge it. The other view was anything as massive as a continent cannot possibly move. Then in the early 1900s along came Alfred Wegener, a respected lecturer and explorer from the University of Marburg in Germany. At the Geological Association in Frankfurt in 1912, he proposed his theory of continental drift. And he brought compelling proof: identical fossil finds on either side of the Atlantic, similarities in geology between mountains in North America and the Scottish Highlands. His theory was considered ludicrous, and he faced a lot of hostility. Wegener died in 1930, and in his obituary they described him as an excellent academic. But his theory of continental drift was dismissed as a bizarre fantasy and an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise distinguished career. In fact, the theory of continental drift only became widely accepted in the scientific community 35 years after Wegener's death and 350 years after it was first suggested. In fact, history is full of very similar examples, great scientific discoveries that were considered outrageous when they were first proposed, and yet today are seen as obvious and self-evident. The same thing happens in companies. The world is full of ideas that were rejected when they were first proposed, yet today are just part of the normal business landscape. You can almost imagine the conversation that Ted Turner, the visionary founder of CNN, had with his stakeholders before launching. Now remember, at the time when he launched, the news segment was really just a half-an-hour segment at most, part of the broader programming content. And he suggested, well, we're going to have a 24-hour news channel. That's all we're going to show, nothing but news. And on top of that, we're going to repeat the news over and over and over again, and people will love it. At the time, this would have been considered an outrageous idea. And yet today, CNN and all the other dedicated 24-hour channels are just seen as part of ordinary entertainment. So why does that happen? Two reasons. The first is that we're designed to resist change, to protect the status quo. We are naturally drawn into our comfort zones and we resist attempts to move us out of there. We don't question old rules and procedures, and we start saying things like, because that's the way things are done around here, and we believe that that's a valid reason to reject an idea. And the second reason is that all the ideas that we encounter are filtered by our brains through our mental models of the world. A mental model is our perception or understanding of how the world works. It helps us make sense of the world. Often it's shaped by our beliefs. Some are developed in childhood, others later in life, but they affect our expectations in profound ways. We tend to reinforce these mental models over time by focusing on information that's consistent with our beliefs and by actively seeking out information that confirms our point of view. It's called the confirmation bias. If the environment we're in is consistent and our mental models prove useful and appropriate, then they become stronger. And as they become stronger, they become more and more resistant to change. Your mental models also determine how a new idea will be interpreted. We find it very stressful to hold beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that are incompatible with each other. It's called cognitive dissonance. And if a new idea attacks a particular belief or mental model that we hold, it will be ignored. And if it can't be ignored, then it will be strongly resisted. Where two different groups have different mental models of the world, sometimes they interpret the same event in radically different ways. In April 2007, following the tragic shooting of 32 students and staff at Virginia Tech by Cho Seung-hui, some commentators used it to illustrate the dangers of easy access to guns. The National Rifle Association, on the other hand, used it to argue the opposite point, for wider gun ownership, because then students and staff would have been able to protect themselves. Closer to home, we have the tragedy at Marikana, where platinum mine workers were tragically gunned down by police during strike action. A lot of people know that in fact the mine workers were treated by a sangoma or witch doctor before charging the police, who gave them tribal medicine or muti to make them immune to the police's bullets. Of course, we know that it didn't happen. Unfortunately, many of the mine workers were killed by the police's bullets. Logically, the mine workers should have lost faith in the sangoma because the muti did not work. In fact, the opposite happened. In fact, the miners believed that more people would have been killed if the sangomas weren't there. And the survivors were even more convinced because, look, I'm alive. Obviously, the muti worked for me. What about the people who died? Well, they didn't follow instructions properly, and that's why they died. Amazing. The way we view the world is so clouded by our mental models. One of the most common implications of this in the business world is the so-called not invented here syndrome. This is the tendency for well-established groups to think that they've got a monopoly on knowledge and ignore any idea that comes from outside the group. They tend to build up rigid mental models and become blind to any information that doesn't fit. If you've ever taken an idea to another department in the organization and had it rejected for no logical reason whatsoever, you'll know what I'm talking about. It used to happen to me all the time, and it's really frustrating. In 1982, two researchers, Katz and Allen, examined the performance of 50 project teams in a big laboratory. And they discovered something very interesting. In the first 18 months, the performance increased as people got to know each other and trust each other. But after about 4 years, performance actually started to decline. And after 5 years, it had declined to such an extent that there was no difference between the performance of that group and a brand new group. Why? Because these groups began to isolate themselves and ignore other groups that had value to add. They became inward-looking and stopped communicating. You see, individuals group themselves together to reduce stress and uncertainty. They want their own familiar and comfortable environment. They form their own mental models of what's going on, their own jargon. And they isolate themselves from anything that would threaten the security of that environment, including ideas that would require them to change. Another key factor influencing how we react to ideas is who is presenting the idea. Our expectations have a huge influence on how we react. Let me give you two examples. Have a look at this video. We see what we expect to see, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary. A second example. Do you remember a few years back there was that controversy about devil music, where if you took certain songs, popular songs, and played them backwards, then all of a sudden you'd hear these satanical lyrics coming through. One of the bands that was at the center of this controversy was Led Zeppelin, and in particular their hit Stairway to Heaven. Now this is what their song sounds like played normally. Now I'm going to play that song in reverse and listen to what it sounds like. To me, it sounds like an unintelligible mess, but listen for yourself. Didn't sound like much at all, right? In fact, what's all the fuss about? Now I'm going to play it again in reverse, but this time I want you to read the words on the screen at the same time. Wow, didn't expect that, did you? That actually sounds quite sinister. You could actually hear those words as they were singing along. And yet, a minute ago, you were wondering what the fuss was all about. It's a great illustration of the power of our expectations to influence our experience. We hear what we expect to hear even when there is nothing there. A final example. Let's say you're a huge Madonna fan. You turn on the radio and you hear the DJ saying, "This is the latest Madonna single," and he's about to play it. You know, even before you hear it, that you're going to like it. Why? Because you built up certain expectations beforehand based on your past experience. When faced with a new idea, we are heavily influenced by who is giving the idea and our expectations of what that person can offer. Do you listen to certain people's ideas with that bias? Do you dismiss certain people's ideas even before you've heard them properly? Are you prejudging certain people based on your prior expectations? It's very easy to fall into this trap. And now the final mental trap that we often fall into. How often have you heard someone say, "Oh, that's just like my idea," or "Oh, we've tried that before"? How often have you said that? Have a look at this picture. It's of a famous person. Any idea who it is? Right, it's Maggie Thatcher. If I had to turn that the right way around, I'm imagining that this is what you would expect to see. Well, let's turn it around now. Wow, that isn't what you expected at all. That looks quite horrible. So what actually happened here? When we look at the original picture, our brain sees an upside-down face. Now, we've seen hundreds of upside-down faces in the past, and so our brain processes that information the same way it has processed any of the other upside-down faces that it's seen. We take a mental shortcut. It's a pattern. When we turn the picture around the right way up, then our brain looks at each element individually, and then it all of a sudden looks horrible. You see, each person has a certain set of responses or pigeonholes that every event is forced to fit into if possible, and if it doesn't fit, then it gets rejected. We use mental shortcuts all the time. We apply patterns to the world in order to simplify the information that is coming in. In fact, it's how we learn. When we learn something new, our brain forms connections between neurons. And as we repeat that task, so certain of those neural pathways get reinforced, others get ignored. And as you repeat the action still further, those connections get stronger and stronger until eventually the brain instantly brings it up the moment it needs it. So let's say you're learning to drive a car. When you start off, it's very difficult. There's a lot of things to remember. But as you practice more and more, so you build up those neural pathways, and then you stop thinking about it. Eventually it reaches a point where the minute you get into the car, your brain instantly picks up that connection and you don't even have to think about it. It's like walking across a large field. The first time you go there, you can walk anywhere. But as more and more people use the same route, so a light path starts developing. And then a new person who comes to the path will walk on that because that seems to be where everyone has walked. And so the path becomes stronger and stronger until it's the default. And then it becomes the easiest route. It's actually too much effort to walk anywhere else. And it's the same with our minds. Whenever we are faced with something that is similar to something we've encountered previously, our mind automatically searches for the nearest path. And then we process that information the same way we process the information that formed the path in the first place. It's very difficult for us to recognize that we're actually on completely the wrong path or even in the wrong field altogether. The problem comes when we encounter an idea that our brain thinks fits an old pattern we already know. It looks for similarities with other ideas and then lumps them together. It force fits or pigeonholes ideas based on previous ideas. And that's why we say things like, oh, that's just like my idea, or oh, we tried that and it didn't work before, even if the details are actually quite different. So now we've identified the main mental traps we fall into when faced with a new idea. What do we do about it? How do we stop ourselves from falling into those traps? Most of the time, just becoming aware of the traps, knowing about them, goes a long way in stopping yourself from falling into them. But the next time you're feeling negative about a new idea, stop and ask yourself the following questions. Am I resisting change? Am I protecting the status quo? Am I irrationally resisting a move out of my comfort zone? Are my mental models holding me back? Could I be missing the value of the idea because of the way I see the world? Am I resisting the idea because of the not invented here syndrome? Am I being unduly biased by who is proposing the idea? Am I prejudging the idea based on my prior expectations? And if you think that the idea is just like one you tried previously, you need to look if this is really valid or if it's just pigeonholing or force-fitting at work. What were the exact details of your idea? What exactly did you try before? Because very often when you look at it, the details are a bit sketchy, you can't really remember exactly what you did, or there are only broad similarities in one or two areas. And even if it is the same idea and it didn't work, maybe it was a timing issue, and you can take the learnings out of why it didn't work previously to improve the current idea. And finally, remember that experts get it wrong too. This might just be that one time in 10 that you judge it incorrectly. A lot of this is easier said than done. We're fighting the way our brains work. But it's really important to do if you want to give new ideas a chance to grow into great ones. And that's it for today's session. Hopefully it's given you something to think about. Thanks for watching.